while Australians have been focused internally on our election campaign and its outcomes, quite justifiably, the rest of the world has been changing, and mostly these changes are not in our favour. To the extent that our governing class thinks about the wider world, it's mostly about the politics of the United States and Britain. Everyone, it seems, has an opinion about President Trump, for instance, and most of our officialdom has brought the standard line that Brexit is a disaster. But whatever people here think of Trump, and whatever the ultimate Brexit outcome is, deeper changes are taking place in our region with far more impact, particularly longer term on our own country. The unannounced Chinese naval visit is emblematic of changing power dynamics in our region. Our government likes to talk about Australia's largest ever peacetime naval build-up, but our efforts are utterly feeble compared to China's military expansion, which is at breakneck speed and tracking in parallel with its economic growth. In just 40 years, China has come from abject poverty to the world's second largest economy, and it's building military strength to match. It's worth remembering too, also, on the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, that the political liberation that was supposed to come, liberalisation that was supposed to come with more economic freedom, has never happened. The Chinese communists never intended to relax the dictatorship of the proletariat, and under President Xi, the Chinese state is probably more pervasive and more controlling than at any other time since Chairman Mao. Ask the Uyghurs, ask the Falun Gong, ask the business people who fall foul of some local party chieftain. Even Russia, with an economy the size of Italy, is still a military superpower with the capability of deploying an intimidating naval task force off the waters of Queensland, as it did during our G20 in Brisbane and the shirt fronting of President Putin over MH17. In Canberra, there's still a tendency to think that we can rely on the United States as our shield against unfriendly powers. That, of course, assumes an American military dominance that's rapidly eroding and a continuing American willingness to act as the world's policeman. Now, it's far from clear that America could now protect Taiwan, for instance, against Chinese aggression, and it's even less clear under President Trump that America would take great risks on behalf of others' vital interests rather than just its own. Of course, armed conflict between great powers would be unthinkable in the modern era of nuclear weaponry and other things, but just because it's unthinkable doesn't mean it could never happen, particularly when you factor in rogue nations and terror organisations and all manner of biological hazards and chemical weapons. And even if China and the US do no more than warily eye each other off over trade and strategic influence, there's little doubt that China's weight and reach will grow, and America's relatively will decline. As Vietnam, the Philippines and even Japan can attest, China does try its best to pressure and intimidate its neighbours. And the Middle Kingdom's view about what constitutes its neighbourhood is ever expanding, even into the South Pacific. While careful not to be explicit, this was, of course, in part why the Prime Minister was in Honiara yesterday announcing expensive new infrastructure commitments so that our neighbours stay close to us rather than get their heads turned by China's cash. Of course, because China is one of our most important trade partners as well as a strategic competitor, it makes the relationship more complicated and more difficult to manage. Compared to all of this, Peter Dutton's emergency trip to Sri Lanka to reinforce the government's continued hard line against people smuggling, well, that looks almost reassuring. Illegal boats are a bad business, but at least we know how to deal with them. Just imagine, though, if it was Christina Keneally who instinctively thinks that all boat people should be resettled in Australia. Imagine if it was Christina Keneally who's dealing with this latest surge in illegal boats. And imagine too if it was Anthony Albanese who agreed with Paul Keating's description of our intelligence agencies as nutters, who was in charge of the very complex relationship we have with China. Forget the economic imperative to have the coalition running the country for a moment. These are increasingly troubling times when it comes to our security as well. Yet another reason why we can all be thankful that the quiet Australian wasn't so quiet on the 18th of May.